Hey everybody, it's Ditkaz here, and in today's video, we're coming in with my final thoughts and rankings on all the shows I watched during the summer 2024 anime season. This is the largest season I've had in terms of the number of shows that I've watched, like ever in a single season, and I actually was behind on getting started on this season because I was behind on the spring season whenever it was ending up. So by the time I got started, the season was actually halfway over. So I spent like 3 weeks doing nothing but watching anime when I got back from work. So it was kind of an exhausting season for me. But there were still some really good shows this season, regardless of how kind of tired I was by the end, just because of how much binging I had to do. As always, if you're trying to avoid spoilers, either skip past the parts on shows that you don't want to be spoiled on, or just hold off on this video until a later date when you're all caught up on those shows to hear my opinions. Just like always, we're starting at the bottom of the list, so let's get to it. At number 20, we have Sengoku Yoko, and this show just makes me sadder the more it goes on. I honestly feel like I'm just kind of in too deep and come too far with it to drop it at this point, even though I just get more and more disappointed as the show goes on with each episode, pretty much. It seemed like such an interesting concept to me whenever I first saw the trailer and read about it. But then that first season was one of the least interesting that I watched the season that it aired. But it did end in a way that seemed like it was setting it up for a more interesting second season. And then I feel like they just kind of dropped the ball with it from there. Again, the only real interesting bits to me this season were seeing Shinsuke kind of get better with the magic sword Arabuki that he got towards the end of the first season, as well as the Shogun they introduce partway through the season that's like a total badass. But then he ends up dying, even though he can see the future, and there are multiple things he could have done to prevent that future from coming to fruition and could have saved himself, but he just chooses not to because I guess he decides it's what's for the best for whatever reason. The fact that after the Shogun dies, Shinsuke, who's my personal favorite character on this show and really the only character that's currently active in the show that I think has a really compelling story going for him, to the point that he's really the only character I care about and maybe the only reason that I'm really even watching this show at this point, gets stuck behind a barrier in a village so that he can maintain that barrier, causing the show to focus more on Senya, who up to this point, at the end of the third core of the show, I still couldn't care less about. Really is disappointing for this show, in my opinion. At the time of recording this video, the fall season has actually started with the fourth core of Sengoku Yoko starting with it. And so far, a couple episodes in, the only thing that the show really has going for it this core is that Shinsuke is now free to leave this village, so hopefully he's going to become more of a focal point for the series again, allowing me to be more engaged with this show and more interested in it, along with anyone else who shares my opinions on this show like that in these different characters. Again, at this point, I just feel like I've watched way too many episodes to drop it already. It's kind of like a sunken cost fallacy thing at this point. At number 19, and I think this is one that people might really disagree with me on, and I might catch some flack for, depending on how much traction this video gets, I have My Dear Friend Nokotan. I think the show was maybe the most hyped show coming into this season, while ending up being one of the most heavily criticized during the season because of supposedly using AI subs, at least in the Crunchyroll sub. I don't know if that's actually what happened or not, so I'm not really going to comment on that aspect of it beyond that. All in all, I think this show was really crazy, and at times it was very funny. I think the character designs are cute, if most of the characters outside of Koshitan and Nokotan are just kind of there and kind of indifferent to really care about them too much most of the series. The animation wasn't anything crazy to write home about. It was good, but it wasn't anything super spectacular other than moments where they went into super slow motion, and then the animation would go really hard for some reason in those moments. That's where they decided to put all their budget, I felt like. I also wasn't a fan of the hyper-realistic deer that show up at various points throughout the whole show. I get it's a gag series, but overall, I felt that its particular brand of gag of the week never really hit that well all the time. Maybe because of how uneven I personally found the level of funny in the show from episode to episode and bit to bit was. I also feel like there were a few different things that they set up for and then never actually had a payoff for. Plus, you had examples like the the episode with the hunter chasing after Nokotan, and the finale that I kind of just felt like were really, really strange episodes that I didn't really find too much funny with those episodes at all that I can think of at this point, that I can remember. Not a terrible show, but also not as incredible as I was thinking or hoping it was going to be, especially after seeing the initial previews and stuff for it, and I was pretty hyped for it with what the potential for this show seemed like, and it ended up just kind of playing out a little bit different than what I thought. At number 18, we have No Longer Allowed in Another World. Honestly, I didn't think this show was going to be this low on the list, but whenever I sat down to make this list and started really thinking about it, I realized that I just liked all the shows above it at least a little bit more than it. I did think that this was a really interesting isekai series, and I thought it was really funny pretty much the whole way throughout. The fact that the main character is just trying to die the whole series, but he can't because all the other characters keep jumping in heroically to save him, and things like how some creatures try to eat him, but he's like poisonous to them because of all the toxins he's taken into his body. And even more so, how this show has an explanation for Truck-kun that typically isekais people so much as a trope in many of the shows out there, gets explained as a actual official part of people being summoned to this world, I thought makes for some very incredibly funny bits at various points in this series. The characters are all pretty interesting, but the animation itself is kind of just okay, and the overall pacing of the show is a little bit weird to me, and it's kind of confusing at times. I'm not really sure where the story's gonna go, assuming that it ends up getting another season in the future, because there's just nothing that's really been resolved yet, and I feel like there's more questions than answers at the end of this first season. At number 17, we have Failure Frame. I became the strongest and annihilated everything with low-level spells. This show. This show absolutely should have been at the top of my list by all accounts. You have a really cool isekai story with a revenge plot as the main character gets betrayed by the goddess who summoned him and his classmates to this fantasy world. It's pretty quickly revealed that the main character actually came from an abusive upbringing that led him to being a very violent child as a youth before he was rescued by his aunt and uncle from his abusive parents, and then he kind of like suppresses that way of being until basically getting thrown to the wolves, for lack of a better phrase, by this goddess, and seeing that part of himself kind of come back out makes for a very interesting isekai main character, in my opinion. You have the underdog aspect of him being considered worthless by the goddess and his other classmates because of his hero ranking, but then he ends up becoming literally 100 times stronger than all of his more superior classmates after being thrown into a basically hopeless situation where he's expected to die. All the character designs are really cool, and the characters that specifically start traveling with him throughout the show all have really cool, deep backstories that kind of make you want to be invested in them, in my opinion anyway. The voice acting is great, and I thought the story was really interesting the whole way through, and it left me wishing that this show was actually a 2-core season right off the rip. But here it is, down way towards the bottom of my list, simply because this show is the worst example I think I've ever seen of overusing 3D CG in an anime. And it's honestly the worst 3D that I think I've ever seen in an anime. I mean, honestly, I think there are sequences in this show that were done in 3D that look worse than PlayStation 2 or at least PlayStation 3 game cutscenes. The worst parts are when there's only one character, like the main character, on the screen with nothing else going on, and they still render it pretty much entirely in 3D, or at least that character in 3D. I mean, there is literally a scene where it's just the main character in an in-room, and he like turns and sits down on his bed, and they did his character entirely in 3D, and it looks like absolute garbage. It's completely unacceptable. It made me physically ill, and like I was furious. I was so angry watching that scene. If the CG was better quality and or less prevalent, this show would easily be a top 10 for me this season. If it wasn't present at all, other than maybe for like the inhuman monsters that they have throughout the show, it would probably be challenging for the top spot on my list this season, and probably be one of my top series for the year in general. Regardless, I still want to see where this story goes, so if it doesn't get more seasons going forward, I'll probably have to see if they have the light novel translated into English so I can buy it. At number 16, we have the Osan newbie adventurer trained to death by the most powerful party becomes invincible. I was sold on this show from watching the trailer and hearing the kind of trolly opening theme song they had for it. I couldn't pass it up at that point. I really like shows with concepts like this where you have a character who has a dream that maybe isn't super realistic for them, or maybe they don't properly chase it going in the beginning because of certain things, but they never fully give up on that dream. And then in the long run, they end up being rewarded by having that dream realized and things go well for them. I also think it's really hilarious in this particular show how this 30-something-year-old adventurer, after being trained by this party, has no idea really at first just how powerful he is when he's demolishing through these newbie adventurer tests and thinking that it's just faulty machinery or faulty tests and things like that, and that he's like the bottom of the barrel when he's the cream of the crop of the people going into this class. Most of the animations in this show are pretty good, and I think the character designs are all great. The world building they've done is kind of limited, but what is there I think is really, really good and shows a lot of potential going forward. There's also a lot of really funny gags in this show, despite the actually very serious mission that the main character and the rest of the party of adventurers that trained him are going on during this show. The biggest flaw for this show is probably its pacing, because it really feels like not a whole lot gets accomplished in this first season, but I'll definitely still want to watch more, assuming it gets animated for future seasons going forward. At number 15, we have Why Does Nobody Remember Me in This World? And this is a modern fantasy type series that takes place in a world that is not our Earth, but there's still like guns and cars and all that. Why, like I said, it's a modern fantasy type thing because there's also all kinds of different beings other than humans going on there, with like elves and demons and beast folk, and the other ones is like spirits or whatever is the fifth faction in this show. The show also kind of ends up becoming maybe an isekai, but realistically, instead of taking place in a whole new world or reality or dimension, it seems like it's actually just that history in the same world gets rewritten. So I think it's more of an isekai adjacent. Like it's like that close to being an isekai. This weird new history ends up coming into play, and the main character is completely forgotten from that history. The main character Kai meets a strange person who is actually a combination of humans and all of the other races that they were at war with, because it's like the War of the Five Great Races. And that war had actually ended in his original timeline like hundreds of years in the past, but in this new rewritten timeline was still ongoing and humans were still losing. This ends up setting the stage for a kind of really weird but also interesting show with a really cool storyline. I think all the character designs are really cool, but the animations are subpar compared to most of the shows this season, especially for an action-heavy show that kind of just puts forth the bare minimum during all of its combat sequences. All the characters that Kai befriends during this show are all really interesting, and I'm really hoping to get more seasons of this show going forward so that I can see if everything gets resolved or how it gets resolved, and find out if the original timeline that he came from gets restored or not. At number 14, we have Bye Bye Earth. This show might just be the weirdest show I've maybe ever watched. It has great animation, interesting and dynamic fight scenes, and a lot of really, really cool fantasy creatures, with all of the characters being like beast people, animal people of different kinds, as only the main character is a human in this show. Watching the trailer for it, I thought this show was going to be about the main character kind of fighting alone, or maybe with some allies as it went, against a whole bunch of these animal people, but it ends up being she becomes a knight fighting in service to a king of these animal people so that she can earn the right to travel beyond this nation's borders and try to find more people like herself and kind of find where she belongs. One of the weirdest things is how this show is actually very musically oriented, with all of their military units are kind of divided using musical terminology, and they're led by like a conductor, and they have a score writer who makes up their battle plans, and everything that they do in combat in their big large-scale combats is like planned out with different waves of like the acts of the show, so to speak. And even if a combat is basically over, the actual issue is resolved, they still continue fighting in one of these like wars they have until they've basically played through the whole score. It's kind of a weird thing going on there. The large-scale conflicts they have in this show do use some 3D CG, but it's at least decent, and I can understand it when there's that many people on screen because it does save a lot of time for them. The show ended up only having 10 episodes, but if I remember correctly, there's a second core coming up some point here in a few months that should be, I think, another like 12 episodes going forward. Hopefully, at least some of the questions they left us with get answered, because one of my favorite characters kind of becomes a villain towards the end of the show, it seems like, and I'd like to see him maybe at least come back around, or at least see how that ends up getting resolved, because again, it's kind of a weird show, and I'm not sure exactly what's supposed to be going on in the long run. Also, I hate this king guy and his weird freaky bug body and second chest face. At number 13, we have My Wife Has No Emotion. This was one of the cuter shows on the season, but it was also kinda strange. The main character purchases a robot to help him with cooking so that he has one less chore he has to really deal with on top of his day job, but he ends up kind of falling in love with it and deciding to make it considered his wife, which apparently he's not the only person that thinks robots would be his family members in this show. It's not a super common thing the way they talk about it, and it doesn't show too many other characters that think like him, but they do imply that it happens in this series. The fact that this particular robot very much has a lot of inhuman-looking features, such as very metallic-looking limbs that are visible, and doesn't even actually have a moving mouth, it just kind of comes out of a speaker, kind of makes it seem like a weird choice for a robot to develop those kind of feelings for, but who am I to really judge? It's a fantasy world. Maybe something like that would happen more often when robots like that actually become more mainstream in our society, because it's surely going to happen eventually here soon. Where things get really interesting is where it turns out that his particular robot was actually an experimental prototype by the guy who originally made her series of robots, and she has kind of a more advanced AI to her that makes her kind of learn more about people's emotions and causes her to exhibit more of a range of emotions and grow and change as she has more experiences with humans in a way that people don't expect her to do for being a very basic housekeeping model. You then get to see this same thing pass on to a much simpler, smaller robot that is kind of taken to care for her master while she is away being upgraded, and it kind of gets affected the same way and becomes kind of like hers and her master's child in that regard. Instead of being able to perform its own functions, it kind of takes on like more of a mind of a toddler that just learns very fast, and it talks completely different and it acts completely different than it's supposed to, and it's implied that it's because of her interfacing with it and her software kind of almost infecting that robot in a way. This makes for a really interesting family dynamic that they have that I kind of thought was like really adorable. I really loved Mamoru, the little robot, a lot. Again, the main robot is not incredibly human looking outside of like she has like a face like that, but there are very clear robotic details. And when there is a moment where she gets to go away for upgrades, before that, when they're picking them, I thought it was strange that the main character chose to not upgrade her looks to make her at least slightly more human-like, since he did consider her his wife. But it's kind of implied that he wants to show that, yes, I love you the way you are. I don't want you don't need to be more human for me to care about you. But I mean, they could have done at least something with it if they, even without giving her the full Super Mina treatment, which is like the full top of the line model of her type of robot. The art is kind of on the simpler side in this show, but it's not an action show at all, so it doesn't really need to do anything too crazy, and the animation is like buttery smooth in my opinion. I wish there was more of the main character's family shown in this show, but there's always the possibility of more story the way they ended it, in my opinion. I don't know if there's actually more to it or not from its original manga or anything like that. So if there is more story to tell and it gets another season animated, maybe that'll get remedied and improved on in a future season. I don't know. Really, this show presents kind of an interesting perspective on AI and everything, the way it's becoming more and more prevalent in our society, and how recently there's been things on the news talking about robots kind of coming out as a more mainstream thing for people to own in their homes before we know it in the future. So for all we know, sometime even in my lifetime, we might see a story like this actually become real life instead of just being a story in a made-up anime. At number 12, we have Days with My Stepsister. This show is a little bit more serious and dramatic than a lot of the other slice-of-life series that I've watched, or just shows in general that I've watched, really. Where most shows like this are a little bit more upbeat the whole way through, and like the new families come together and they all get along and everything's happy, and A lot of times in anime, these new step siblings end up developing feelings for each other almost right off the bat. That doesn't happen in this show because it kind of keeps it a little bit more grounded, with a more serious tone, and the siblings kind of keep their distance from each other in the beginning because they kind of both had a rough go of it growing up to this point in various ways. Even not that at least the male sibling and his dad were badly off, but some drama happened when he was younger. The boy is very distrustful of women because his mother actually cheated on his father and left, so he basically grew up without a mother. And the daughter grew up really poor and kind of had to deal with an abusive father before he left her mother, even though her mom was just trying her best to kind of keep the family going and working harder, and he still just kind of blamed her and yelled at her, and I'm pretty sure it's implied that he beat his wife at the time. These new siblings set a boundary from the get-go as they consider themselves strangers, but they still make sure to get along, especially in front of their parents, because they're very mature for their age and want to make sure that their family is able to be happy and that their parents are happy and they don't cause any waves and issues in this new marriage going on. This doesn't stop the siblings from ending up eventually kind of falling for each other and developing feelings anyway, although it seems like the sister kind of develops, or at least realizes she has feelings first, but they both kind of realize it kind of one right after the other, and they both openly suppress those feelings because they don't want to make waves, and they're like, this is the one person I can't have feelings for, until eventually they kind of end up admitting it, mostly because the boy admits it first, and then she admits her feelings, and they decide that they're going to keep these feelings a secret from their parents while still talking about it and kind of trying to figure out exactly what these feelings are, how deep they are, and where they're going to go from there, as they clearly feel like they're in love with each other. From the moment I watched the preview of this show, I said that it looked like there was a good shot this show was actually going to make me cry, and although I didn't end up crying, I did not. It was a very emotional show, and the musical choices they had really kind of amplified that. It's really good, subtle music throughout the whole series. The art, design, pacing, and direction were all excellent in this show, in my opinion, but I was sad to not see things with their relationship kind of get resolved one way or another by the end of this season. I feel like there's still plenty to tell with this story, as there are a couple other characters they've already confirmed and shown have interest in each of the step siblings, and there's maybe others that they haven't confirmed that or not, but it is a possibility the way things kind of play out there. And there are many different ways that their relationship could play out, and a bunch of different ways that it could affect their new family going forward when all of that would eventually, come to a head one way or another, depending on how they all react and how that would go. So I'd be very interested to see at least another season of this show at some point in the future, just to kind of get a resolution to all of these story threads that kind of feel like they're just still hanging there. At number 11, we have Dahlia in Bloom. This is like the last show that I added to my list because I had actually forgot about Sengoku Yoko continuing when I was counting up what shows I had. So I was going to be watching an odd number of shows, and I always watch an even number, so I needed to add a show back onto the list because I wasn't taking one off. Much like the Aristocrat Isekai series that started last season and is having its second core now in the fall season, I'm really glad I didn't skip out on this show because I enjoyed this show quite a lot, really. It's a very cute, mostly wholesome isekai series that the isekai aspect of it doesn't come into play a whole lot. It's about a salary working woman who dies at her desk after overwork and ends up living in a fantasy world where her father is a magic artificer. He makes magic tools, and she ends up kind of falling in love with that trade and taking after her father, and proceeds to kind of make a lot of waves in the world by coming up with inventions that are based off of things from her past life. Like, she comes up with the idea of how to use the magic of that world and the tools of that world to make a hair dryer, to make her friend who's a hairdresser's life easier. And she makes waterproof fabrics for raincoats and tarps and tents. And this big thing that's probably the realest thing ever of making insoles and socks that can help prevent foot fungus that the army goes absolutely crazy for. There are a couple points early in the series that are really, really sad, like her father dying when she's still just kind of early into adulthood and not fully on her own yet. And then shortly after that, I think it's a year later or something like that, her fiance actually cheats on her and calls off their engagement. And she takes it well enough because she wasn't really in love with this guy. It just kind of, the whole thing was an agreement between their parents so that they could kind of take care of each other. But she bounces back quickly, ends up starting her own company, and ends up better than ever in the long run after everything goes there. There is still a romance angle when Dahlia, the main character, ends up meeting a knight out on the road named Wolf, and she's pretending she's a guy at the time, but he ends up seeing her in town when she's not in disguise, and he's able to recognize her, and they become friends, and they kind of keep everything kind of like low key, and they are both kind of not looking for romance, so they're definitely both not realizing that they're falling in love with each other at this point in the show. But they're really good friends. They help each other out a lot. He introduces her to people and helps make connections and helps her business out. And she kind of does like different tests and stuff for him. And like one of the big points in the show is her trying to make a kind of different kind of magic sword that magic artificers don't normally do. That's normally like wizards in this world, and she's trying to make one for him so that it can help him with his work. Both of these characters are like trying to just kind of stay friends and avoid romance in their lives, and like I said, I think that's why they kind of have blinders on, and that's why they don't realize that they're falling for each other, but kind of everybody around them realizes that they're developing feelings for each other, and it's only a matter of time before it happens, assuming we get more of this show animated in the future. Hopefully we do get more of this show because I really want to see Dahlia's business continue to improve and her relationship with Wolf evolve, as it's just kind of incredibly sweet and cute, and I just really want to see an actual conclusion to this story as well. At number 10, we have A Nobody's Way Up to an Exploration Hero. This is another modern fantasy series, but it's a little bit more of a cutesy type series, and it's a little different in the way that it's presented. The whole plot is that in our world, a dungeon appears in like the middle of Japan, and a park kind of opens up around it, and like it's still a dangerous thing, but there's a lot of like safety precautions going in there. And the main character goes into the dungeon every day for years and years, and after like 2 years, he finally levels up, and he actually gets a lucky drop that gets him a summoned partner, and he thinks about selling it because they're really rare and worth a lot of money, but he decides to summon it, and it ends up being a like Valkyrie girl, and takes the form of like kind of a little kid who's like this really cute girl, but again, she's like younger looking, and she's really powerful, and she helps him kind of explore more of the dungeon, and he starts leveling up more, and then he gets like another summon that's like a little demon girl, and eventually they fight this bigger demon, but they manage to win, and he gets another summon out of that, and becomes a little boy, because apparently what happens is when they become summons, they lose like a lot of their power. So as they level up, eventually in theory they get enough levels, they will end up taking their more original adult forms, because like the demon has a power that she gets after she levels up a few times that allows her to drain power from him, and it boosts her power a whole bunch, and she takes on that adult form. Eventually, the main character befriends another group of adventurers, and it turns out that all of them, like there's 4 of them in total, they all kind of want to become heroes for different reasons. And it ends up being that he wants to become a hero because his crush's father was like the forefront like explorer of this dungeon, and he went missing. He was considered a hero to the people, but then he went missing years and years ago, but there's still like hope that he's alive. So he wants to become this hero and try to like find her father, even though she doesn't want him going into the dungeon because she's worried about his safety, just like she didn't want her dad going into the dungeon when that was his job, basically. It ends up turning out that one of the people in his party is sick with a terminal illness, so her reason is trying to find an elixir item that can cure any illness and fix her illness, and she figures if she finds that, she can also help maybe improve the lives of other people who are sick like her in the future. This causes the main character to really kind of make it even more of a goal to try to like rush to find that elixir, because she ends up getting like bedridden and having to be in the hospital, and that's when everyone finds out about her illness, which I think at that point he was the only one that really didn't know. Maybe it was the other like girl that was like the leader of their party at first didn't know either. I don't remember the exact details, but they're rushing to find it. They end up not finding the elixir in the end, but they do find a different summon that's a healer summon. Then they're like, maybe she can fix him. So this new healer summon ends up making a contract with the girl who is sick, but she's unable to fully cure her illness, but is able to like relieve the symptoms for, I believe they said, a year. So she no longer like feels that she's basically cured, the equivalent of cured, but it only lasts a year. But she implies that if she gets enough levels, she'll gain a better heal spell and actually be able to fully cure her. So the story going forward is that she's going to basically try to level her up and get to where they can cure her within a year. The characters are all really cute and well designed in this show, but in general, the art is kind of simpler, and the combat sequences are kind of just the same set of animations being reused over and over again, and they're not crazy detailed. The only other real issue with the show is that the main character is kind of like stereotypically really badly oblivious to the fact that his crush actually likes him back, even though his friends from school pretty much blatantly come out and say, hey, like, she's clearly worried about you. She's definitely into you. How do you not notice this? And he's like, oh, she doesn't have feelings for me. That being said, I did really enjoy this show. And I think it's really, really cute, and I hope that it does get another season. I will definitely continue watching it if it does. At number 9, we have The Cafe Terrace and Its Goddesses Season 2. I was super excited to see this second season was already coming out, as a huge fan of the first season. I'm not ashamed to admit that I like a good fan service series. I mean, that's why it's called fan service. You're expected to like it. And the author of the manga that this series is adapted from, Seo Koji, I personally think is very top tier with it, with their fan service and their character designs, which is why I've read most of the series that they've written, like Fuka, Suzuka, and A Town Where You Live, and a few others from there. This season continues the story of a boy named Hayato, who takes over his grandmother's cafe, seaside cafe, after she passes, and it turns out that there are 5 girls living there and working there as waitresses, and they all have this connection that they end up kind of growing into going forward as they kind of like figure out how they're going to live together and make things work. This second season actually starts with a competing shop opening up in town because the guy who kind of his grandmother owed money to or something, there was kind of a fight with him in the first season, and he kind of had already tried to do a little bit of things to kind of take them apart. He opens up this shop to directly try to destroy them, but the people at Cafe Terrace Familia quickly kind of figure things out, keep things afloat, and actually end up almost putting the other one out of business, but they end up becoming friends with the girls that are running that, helping them out and keeping that business afloat. And I think he kind of becomes the owner of that shop with like a loan or something like that as well. I don't remember the exact details of that. This season ends up giving even more detail on all of the main girls, and you end up finding out that all of their grandmothers actually worked at the original Cafe Familia that Hayato's grandfather had opened up years and years and years in the past, and they were all friends. And it kind of seems like it's implied that they all had feelings for his grandfather before they kind of went their separate ways, and he ended up marrying Hayato's grandmother. As this season goes on, more of the girls openly realize and admit their feelings for Hayato, and he ends up deciding to quit college permanently and work at the cafe to make it work and keep it successful because it's the family business. I feel like that makes it seem like this story is kind of quickly coming towards its climax, as he's going to have to pick one of these girls to end up marrying, because there's 3 of them at this point that have openly said, yes, I'm into him, I want to marry this guy. But it kind of gets a little bit of a wrench thrown in it, as Oka, the fashion designer girl who makes all of their outfits, and kind of seems like the front runner the way a lot of things play out in this show. She doesn't openly say that she's in love with him. She kind of denies it a little bit, but she's also like the first girl that he meets and sees like in her underwear whenever he first comes in season 1. And so a lot of the things kind of set her up as like the lead heroine of this harem. She actually moves to, I believe, France to work with an international designer and improve her craft. So I'm not sure exactly how that all is going to end up affecting everything with the story going forward. Hopefully we get to see the rest of this series animated, because the art and the character designs are great. Seo Koji always does a great job with that, in my opinion. All the characters are lovable, and I don't feel like there's a bad possible outcome, because all of the girls are great, in my opinion, in this particular harem. I just need to know who he ends up going with. At number 8, we have VTuber Legend, How I Went Viral After Forgetting to Turn Off My Stream. This is a show that absolutely had to make my list after how much I've kind of got into watching VTubers over the past year. A lot of people really hyped this show up, and I do kind of feel like it was an incredible series throughout. And it was really funny seeing some of the VTubers I follow commenting about how it almost seems like the main character was them, even though I'm pretty sure this show came out before, or the manga or whatever came out before some of them even debuted. I think, or around a similar time, and before they started acting as degenerate as some of these characters act. At times, I kind of wish the story of this show was a little bit more cohesive, because after the first couple episodes, it kind of falls into this like gag of the week formula that is good. It is good, mind you. Until like the last maybe couple episodes actually, that is a really heartfelt story about a lot of the characters that get introduced. The other really cool thing with this show is how it actually uses live 2D like VTubers use. Whenever the characters are actively live streaming and it's like supposed to be showing them on screen, like what the viewers would be seeing them doing on screen, they did their models in live 2D. And if I remember correctly, I saw where a lot of these VTubers actually have these avatars, like these models exist, and people used and streamed with these avatars and did collabs with like HoloLive in Japan. Although I am not super familiar, I don't remember who they collabed with specifically, because I don't particularly watch HoloLive, as I watch all of my VTubers on Twitch, and the only time I really see HoloLive stuff is like some stuff on Twitter, like clips like that, and if my best friend will show me like clips and VODs sometimes, because he'll watch stuff on YouTube a lot. That's just not where I get my VTuber fix from. I have no idea if there's going to be more of this show, but if there is, I'd absolutely be down for it, because there are so many more crazy VTuber parody characters I'm sure they could come up with and put out there on this show, and all kinds of crazy like circumstances that could happen just based off of the things that I've seen in the year that I've really been watching VTubers pretty much every day. Number 7, we have Shy Season 2. This season picks up basically right where the first season left off, but it introduces some new characters with these ninjas of Ai, Mai, and Tokimaru. I do think it's pretty cool getting to see more of the hero Century, and he actually gets to kind of have like a little bit of an actual role in this series, although he doesn't really have time to shine, at least not the way Stardust does, which he has like a really badass fight sequence and then he kind of like gets pushed to the side again, but it's still really cool, and hopefully in future seasons we'll get to see more of Century and he'll kind of get like his moment to really shine in a fight and like really work to defend people. The ninjas are actually really interesting, and it's really cool how they kind of use the same like heart power for their techniques that the heroes use. They just don't have like the heart shift bracelets that the heroes use to get their powers. They just straight up use them for like their sword techniques and stuff, and it's a very similar vibe for them. Overall, I think I liked the second season a little bit less than the first season, and I think that's mostly just because it kind of got weirder and weirder with each episode as it went on. I never really felt like this season answered why the character Mai had one of Stigma's rings on her finger, and that caused her to become part of Amaririku, however you pronounce it. I might have just kind of butchered that. It's kind of a mouthful to say, especially trying to say it quick. And I also hated that she ended up dying in the end of the season after being redeemed and giving up being a villain and, you know, trying to make things right and helping resolve the issues in the end. I understand that stories, especially serious ones like this, can't always be happy, but in the first season we had Spirit's mom turn out to have been like long dead, and that's why she was basically a glorified ghost in her form as a bad guy, but like Mai was still alive as a member of this, so I was hoping that she would be able to pull through and like get to actually spend time with her sister, who never really gave up on her. Maybe it'll turn out that part of her passing is that it actually maybe fixed the physical problem with Ai's heart after her sister had stabbed her in the chest when they were younger, like years before. When it shows that in a flashback, and that's why she like kind of has almost like asthmatic type symptoms and can't like really work too hard for too long, or she starts like having issues breathing. But that's assuming that Ai ends up making a return later in the series. After, you know, the end of this season, she returns back to her ninja village. Although I did say I preferred the first season, I did still really enjoy this season, and I'm looking forward to see where the story goes from here when the next season comes out, whenever that ends up being in the future. At number 6, we have the strongest magician in the Demon Lord's army was a human. I think this fantasy series had a very interesting premise, with almost all of the characters not knowing that the titular magician was in fact a human, except for his direct superior and the Demon Lord, who he didn't even realize knew it at first whenever he first met her, and a maid that is a human maid who is hiding out in a room in a castle of a town that his unit kind of takes over right in the beginning of the show, and she kind of catches him taking his mask off, and she agrees to not say anything, and she just kind of becomes his personal maid at that point. The show starts out with a really quick pace in the first few episodes, but it doesn't feel rushed at all. It's actually it's a good pace for that show, but then it really kind of slows down to a crawl after that first arc or two. The main character Ike actually turns down a promotion to focus on kind of holding the town that he took and really trying to develop relationships between humans and demons and kind of proving that they can coexist together and not have to be just enemies the whole time. The show ends up with him being promoted anyway after some more military successes, and I think it really sets up for a continually interesting story going forward. The biggest complaints I have about this show are that the action sequences aren't as well animated as some others, and it does use a decent bit of 3D CG, but it at least only uses them for the large-scale battles and for the very inhuman-looking, monstrous enemies. So it's not as bad as some of the other series on this list. Looking at you, Failure Frame. Still angry. Really hopeful that we'll get more of this show, because I really want to see how things continue to play out, and I specifically want to see an explanation for why Ike's maid, who was a slave before he took over the town that she was in and became her master, so to speak, looks exactly like a girl he meets later in the series, who is the daughter of the leader of a port city, and who at the end of the show, Ike is technically now engaged to. At number 5, we have Love is Indivisible by Twins. This is the lowest ranked show on my list that I would have to say I had no real issues with it during its run this season. This and the 4 shows above it, I would say, no real complaints. I feel that this was a very well done romance series with a little bit of comedy sprinkled in that has a really, really good balance for the love triangle between the main male character and the twins, Rumi and Naori, who fall in love with him. Both are in love with him since childhood. Things play out in a way that are sure to be frustrating for fans on both sides, regardless of which of the two sisters you prefer. I personally prefer the sporty older sister, Rumi. The show does a great job of teaching the viewers about various things in the 3 main characters' lives and their past that kind of lead them to the point that they're at in the show in the current timeline without actively spending a whole bunch of time on flashbacks telling them. They just kind of real brief, this is something that happened, this is something that happened. It might do a real quick flashback, but it's real concise and it doesn't waste a whole bunch of time on it, and I really appreciate that for that because it allows a lot of the actual current timeline story to be the main focus and not get kind of taken away from too much. All of the characters are fun and interesting pretty much, and there was really only the one character that I didn't really like, and that's the guy who was kind of trying to make a move on Rumi towards the end of the season, and it's revealed that he'd always kind of had a thing for her, but he could tell that she liked the main male character, so he didn't make a move, and then he heard about some stuff, and he's like, oh, well, I'm fine with just being friends, I just kind of want to hang out sometime. But then he says, oh, hey, I'm going to ask her out. And he texts the guy about it. And it's kind of implied that maybe he was only doing it to get this dude to make a decision. But it still kind of is a dick move. And it was kind of irritating in my opinion. Plus it ends up not working. The guy doesn't make a decision at the end of the series regardless, because at the end of the show, after starting the show dating Rumi, and then she breaks up with him and tells him to date the younger sister, Naori, he thinks they're dating, but then she says, no, we were never actually dating. We were just kind of messing around. I never agreed to date you, even though she's in love with him, and she just kind of didn't want to be pitied or whatever. She wanted to earn his relationship, earn his love herself. It then becomes a thing where he's like, well, I'm not going to commit to either one of you because I want to be sure which one of you I'm in love with more and that I want to be with, and I don't want to hurt either one of you. It's not fair in that regard. At the end of the show, he still hasn't made a decision at this point. The show has good art, good character design, with each character being really distinct, and each of them have a very fitting voice actor going for them. I'd like to see more of this show just to see who June ends up actually finally deciding to go out with when he does make that decision. Of course, the correct answer, in my opinion, being Rumi, and, if you don't agree, well, you're allowed to be wrong. At number 4, we have That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, Season 3, Part 2. The second half of the 3rd season of Slime had kind of a decent bit lower stakes than the first half, although it is kind of presented with a new hero character who is implied to be a threat to Rimuru, but he actually wants no part of fighting, and it seems like he might not even really know how to fight. It's just he kind of has this weird charisma skill that causes everybody to just kind of listen to him and follow along and do everything for him. So he never actually has to fight. It's really weird. Everything just kind of works out for him. It's an odd thing in this show where everybody else actually has to really fight or else they kind of die. This whole arc revolving around the festival in Tempest and Rimuru kind of trying to finalize diplomatic relations with a number of nations is actually a really laid back set of episodes, especially after the prior set with everything going on with Hinata and the church, and kind of a lot of conflict kind of coming to a head right there. This part of the season gets to show us a lot of growth from characters like Gobta, where he kind of has like a new fusion technique where he can fuse with like a shadow wolf and kind of like use both their powers together. It was a really cool technique. He's the only person that's shown something like that. It was really interesting, I thought. And we also get to see some other new characters like the Tengu, who live on top of a mountain, and they want to make a railroad through the mountain that the Tengu live on. And it turns out the leader of that Tengu is Hakuro's daughter, and she kind of falls in love with Benimaru on the spot. So they might get married, who knows? I know there's a couple other characters that are interested in him, so curious to see how that plays out. I thought everything with the new dungeon in Tempest was interesting, and seeing the way that Rimuru handles the plot by the Eastern merchants that they had there to try to kind of get him to owe them something and kind of really set him up for a failure. The way he kind of like flips the script, turns it around, gets him paid, and then goes, yeah, you're not allowed to do business here anymore, and kind of just completely ruins their plan, I thought was great. It was an interesting thing. There didn't have to come to bloodshed in this case, so it was, like I said, it was a lot more laid back this season, and I thought it was really satisfying just the way it happened. The other really interesting thing with this season at the end was how Rimuru seems to finally figure out, well, he does figure out, he just doesn't have solid evidence of it, that Yuki, the leader of the Adventurers Guild, is actually the guy who's been kind of pulling the strings behind a lot of the issues that have been plaguing Rimuru and the citizens of Tempest over the past couple seasons. So now he's kind of like trying to figure how he's going to address that and what they're going to do if they really do end up having to fight him at some point in the future. It'll be really interesting to see how some of these plot threads come to a resolution and how some of these inevitable conflicts end up playing out. At number 3, we have Makeine, Too Many Losing Heroines. This show was such an interesting watch, and it was kind of different from maybe anything else I've ever seen in a very good way. It kind of feels like a deconstruction of the harem rom-com genre, with its story focusing on an unpopular character who ends up befriending a bunch of losing heroines. Even though by the end of the show, it does seem like all 3 of these girls end up actually kind of falling in some way, starting to fall in love with the main character. None of them are willing to admit it, and the first girl that he meets that's a losing heroine, and I would say is basically like the main girl, Yanami, actively says, I'm not in love with you, I'm not gonna fall in love with you, it's just not gonna happen. She really shows kind of like all the typical anime signs of falling for a character in a rom-com type series. I think this show has really smooth animation, and the character designs and personalities are a really good mix of common tropes in series like this with some very unique characters mixed in. I also think the entire voice cast did an incredible job bringing this cast to life. With how all 3 girls seem to be at least developing an interest for the main character, and the fact that they still have time in high school left for these characters, I would really like to see at least another season of this show, assuming there's more to the story, as I'm not familiar with how far the original light novel goes. At number 2, we have Alia Sometimes Hides Her Feelings in Russian. I knew from the moment that I saw the preview for this show that I was gonna like this show a lot, but I didn't think it was going to be quite this good or quite this deep, really. This is one of the best animated shows of this season by like a mile easily, in my opinion, with a very familiar yet also very unique art style and character design direction. The characters are all incredibly expressive with particularly well-detailed eyes, like they're gorgeous in this show. The show obviously also stands out vocally, with multiple characters in this show speaking Russian at times, specifically more so than others, the main titular character, Alia, who the whole premise of this show that it comes out with is how she kind of likes to speak in Russian, specifically about the main character, Masachika, not realizing that he actually understands everything she's saying in Russian when she's kind of saying all kinds of things, kind of flirting with him. And it really ends up kind of playing out very, very funny. It leads to some really funny circumstances as he's kind of like trying to hide the fact that he does understand Russian because he doesn't want to embarrass her. It's also really interesting how much her voice changes when she's speaking Russian instead of Japanese. I haven't looked it up. I would assume that it is the same voice actress, in which case it's really impressive how different her voice does sound in those instances when she's speaking Russian. It's very clear, like it doesn't sound like it's something that she didn't study up on and like basically had to learn last minute for this show. She does a great job pronouncing everything from what I can tell. It all sounds great. The concept of a rom-com where the male lead doesn't seem to be able to commit to being interested in the female lead because of other circumstances, in this case, his kind of crazy family circumstances where he's really trying to still be supportive of his semi-estranged younger sister, is just kind of a little different. You then throw in the angle of Alia flirting with him in Russian and him pretending like he doesn't realize it, allowing her to claim she said something else, and the show becomes really, really incredible as just how funny those bits are. Can't wait for more of this series, as I want to see how the election cycle continues to play out and how Alia and Masachika's relationship continues to develop. I'm particularly waiting for Masachika to tell Alia that their opponent in the presidential election is actually his younger sister, not just his childhood friend like he's claimed, because that'll actually kind of clear up a lot of misunderstandings that have kind of been happening between the characters, and it'd be interesting to see how that kind of like changes the dynamic of everything there. Of course, the other elephant in the room is Alia's older sister, who is actually one of the reasons why Masachika learned Russian as a child. One, because his father, or his grandfather, I should say, really likes Russian and Russian women, and so he learned Russian and caused him to learn it, but also because he would speak to this girl who spoke in Russian when he was a child, and it turns out it's actually Alia's older sister. He just hasn't realized it. She, partway through the series, does realize it, the older sister does, and she just kind of keeps it a secret because she keeps talking about like this guy she's in love with, at first not realizing that it's Masachika, but by the end, like partway through the series, she realizes it and kind of like asks him if like he understood what she said in Russian, but he's still playing off that he doesn't. But it's definitely shown from like the way she responds to that like she knows it's him and that he did actually understand her. The only thing that really drove me nuts with this show is how every episode had a different ending theme song, but that's just because it's going to make a whole lot more work for me when it comes to putting together my seasonal theme song tier list, which hopefully I'll have that out next week. We'll see. But they were all really good in my opinion, and I'm pretty sure they were all covers of other series theme songs. Finally, at number 1, we have Wistoria, Wand and Sword. Wistoria is one of the few shows that I think I've ever watched that I literally, racking my brain, I cannot think of anything to try to complain about or think of like a real negative to this show. The art direction and character designs are gorgeous. The animation is fantastic. The voice acting and music are splendid. The setting is interesting. And all of the characters that have been introduced are compelling in some way or another. I love characters like the main character Will, so I was immediately invested in his story. Even the characters that are kind of dicks like Shion and Julius are done in a way that it doesn't drive me insane, and I actually really enjoy both of their characters and their arcs, which usually isn't the case for me. A lot of times, like, I'm the guy who really, like, I can't stand Bakugo through most of My Hero Academia because he's just such an asshole for no good reason. And these guys kind of are too, but just there's something different about the way they're done that it's more acceptable for me. This series actually caught me off guard partway through when it showed a couple characters, specifically Lafia and Philvis. Since I'm a huge Dan Machi fan, like, is it wrong to try to pick up girls in a dungeon? It's one of my favorite series. I have like the first 15 volumes of the light novel back on my bookcase. I have like 12 volumes or however many at the time that I had of like the Sword Oratoria spinoff, and I have like 1 or 2 of the other spinoff, like the Ryu storyline, and I think there's like another spinoff light novel that's specifically about Freya. I'm a huge Dan Machi fan, so seeing those characters who are 2 of the primary, like, recurring characters, they are main characters of the Sword Oratoria spinoff in that show, like, not just by name, like, it's those same character designs. it really made me wonder, like, what's the connection to these shows? And that episode, I immediately went Googling for it, and that's when I found out that the connection is that both Wistoria and Dan Machi are written by the same author. He just apparently likes to reuse characters and themes, which is why both series kind of have like the underground dungeon and the tower going up to the sky in them, in the middle of like this fantasy city, basically. Then, of course, you have Finn getting introduced at the very end, and he's also literally exactly the same as Finn in Dan Machi. I'm curious if there will end up being any actual connection to these series by the time like they're both done. And now I feel like I need to start reading the light novel for Wistoria, since again, I already read Dan Machi and I enjoy it a lot. Maybe my opinion on this anime will worsen if I do read the light novel, since I don't know how good of an adaptation it is, as someone who feels like there's kind of been bad pacing in Dan Machi, at least in some of the early seasons. But as someone who is new to this story, the Wistoria anime has just been absolutely top tier for me. And without thinking too hard, it's definitely a contender for my personal anime of the year at this point. And that's my ranking and final thoughts on the anime that I watched during the summer 2024 season. There's some good and great shows and some solid shows that seemed like they had potential for greatness, but a glaring issue or two kind of held them back, in my opinion. As usual, these lists are only shows that are on Crunchyroll, as I don't have High Dive. So if you're wondering why there are some great High Dive shows that aired this season, I don't know how good the shows on High Dive were or not. That would be why. Make sure to leave a comment about any shows, whether they're on High Dive or Crunchyroll or whatnot, that I might have missed that were good. That way I can check them out at some point in the future. I do still plan on getting High Dive at some point. I'm just kind of trying to get some finances figured out a little bit more and like settled down before I do that. Also, be sure to drop a like on this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. For more content like this, you can check out my spring 2024 ranking right here. And for some different content of mine, you can check out my Twitch channel, where I'm usually gaming like 3 times a week at twitch.tv/Ditkaz. That's Ditkaz. Thanks for watching and have a great day, everybody.